Vienna, March 1854. A 16-year-old girl stands in the Augustinerkirche wearing a silver brocade gown that weighs more than any dress she has ever worn. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, married less than an hour, kneels beside her husband during the wedding mass while his mother, Archduchess Sophie, watches from the front pew. The girl had arrived in Vienna 4 days earlier, expecting to watch her older sister become engaged to Emperor Franz Joseph. Instead, he chose her. The decision was made in a single evening. No one asked what she wanted. The wedding is celebrated as a love match. Crowds line the streets. Poets write odes to her beauty. But inside the Hofburg Palace, Elizabeth's new mother-in-law has already chosen her ladies-in-waiting, dictated her daily schedule, and made clear that producing an heir is not a privilege. It is the only function that matters. The girl who loved riding horses in the Bavarian countryside now lives under the observation of dozens of servants in rooms where the windows are kept closed against fresh air. This is not a story about a woman who rose to power. It is about a woman given every luxury except the ability to leave and what that did to her and to the 4 children she would bear and, in different ways, abandon. Elizabeth had been raised without expectation. Her father, Duke Maximilian, preferred writing poetry and playing the zither to attending court functions. Her mother, Ludovica, managed the family's minor Bavarian estate with modest resources and little ambition. The children ran through the woods around Possenhofen, kept animals, learned music. Elizabeth was the second daughter in a household where being second meant freedom from scrutiny. When her mother began arranging a meeting between her eldest daughter, Helene, and their cousin Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, Elizabeth went along as an afterthought. They traveled to Bad Ischl in August 1853 for what was meant to be a private introduction. Helene was 20, composed, trained for the role of Empress. Elizabeth was 15, sunburned from spending the summer outdoors, unaware that she should be performing. On the evening of Franz Joseph's birthday, he danced with both sisters. By the next morning, he informed his mother that he intended to marry Elizabeth, not Helene. Archduchess Sophie had orchestrated the meeting to secure Helene. She had not accounted for her son's sudden preference for a younger, less prepared girl. But Franz Joseph was emperor, and Sophie needed him married to someone she could control. A naive 16-year-old from a minor branch of the family seemed manageable. Elizabeth was told of the engagement before she understood what it meant. There was no proposal. Franz Joseph announced his decision to his mother, and Sophie informed Ludovica, who told Elizabeth that she would be empress. The girl wrote in her diary that she wished the earth would open and swallow her. No one read the entry. The wedding date was set for April 1854. Elizabeth had 8 months to prepare for a role she had never wanted and did not understand. Her mother brought her to Vienna in February for preliminary visits. The Hofburg was larger than any building Elizabeth had seen. The hallways stretched in directions she could not memorize. Servants bowed when she passed, but did not speak unless spoken to. Sophie took her through the imperial apartments and explained the daily routine. Mass in the morning, audiences, state dinners, protocol that dictated when she could sit, when she could speak, whom she could see without supervision. Elizabeth asked if she could go riding. Sophie said the empress did not ride for pleasure. Elizabeth asked if she could visit her family in Bavaria. Sophie said the empress did not leave Vienna without the emperor. The wedding in April filled the Augustinerkirche with foreign dignitaries, Hungarian nobility, and Viennese aristocracy who had waited years for Franz Joseph to marry. Elizabeth walked down the aisle in a dress that required 3 women to carry the train. Her hair had been pulled so tightly into the required style that her scalp ached. During the ceremony, she fainted briefly. Heat, the weight of the gown, the corset cinched to display her 17-inch waist. Franz Joseph caught her, and the congregation took it as romantic. Sophie saw a girl who could not withstand 2 hours of ceremony and wondered how she would manage childbirth. The honeymoon was 3 days. On the 4th morning, Elizabeth woke to find Sophie in her bedroom, reviewing the empress's schedule with the chief lady-in-waiting. There was no discussion of privacy. Sophie had arranged Elizabeth's household entirely. The women who would dress her, accompany her, read her correspondence, report her activities. Countess Esterhazy Liechtenstein, appointed by Sophie as Obersthofmeisterin, informed Elizabeth that she would be expected at breakfast with the Archduchess each morning. Elizabeth said she preferred to breakfast alone. The Countess explained that the Empress's preferences were not the issue. Franz Joseph loved his wife in the way men of his position loved, sincerely, distantly, without comprehension of what she needed. He spent his days reviewing military reports, signing documents, attending ministerial meetings. He had been emperor since he was 18, trained since childhood to prioritize duty over personal feeling. In the evenings, he visited Elizabeth's apartments, asked about her day, then returned to his own rooms to continue working. When she told him she felt suffocated by his mother's supervision, he assured her that Sophie only wanted to help. When she asked if her Bavarian lady-in-waiting could remain in her service, he said his mother had already selected women more familiar with Viennese protocol. Within 3 months of the wedding, Elizabeth was pregnant. Sophie was pleased. Franz Joseph was relieved. Elizabeth was 17 years old in a palace where she knew no one who answered to her, carrying a child she had not chosen to conceive. The pregnancy was treated as a state matter. Doctors selected by Sophie monitored her health. Her diet was controlled. She was forbidden from riding, from long walks, from anything that might endanger the air. When she asked to return to Possenhofen to see her family, Sophie said travel was too dangerous in her condition. The labor in March 1855 lasted 16 hours. Archduchess Sophie was present throughout, along with court physicians and attendants. Franz Joseph waited outside. When the child was born, it was a girl. Sophie named her Sophie after herself before Elizabeth had fully regained consciousness. The baby was taken to a nursery 3 floors away, attended by nurses Sophie had hired. Elizabeth asked when the child would be brought to her. She was told that empresses did not nurse their own children and that the infant's care had already been arranged. Elizabeth was 18, with a daughter she saw twice a day under supervision. Sophie visited the nursery frequently, gave instructions to the nurses, held the baby during family gatherings. Elizabeth was permitted to watch. When she requested that the child sleep in her apartments, Sophie explained that the imperial nursery was properly staffed and that Elizabeth needed rest to prepare for the next pregnancy. Franz Joseph saw no conflict. His mother had raised him. He assumed she would raise his children with the same efficiency. 10 months later, Elizabeth gave birth to a second daughter, Gisela. Again, Sophie controlled the arrangements. Again, the baby was removed to the imperial nursery. Elizabeth was 19, with 2 daughters she was not allowed to mother, in a marriage that functioned as a reproduction contract managed by her husband's mother. She had no authority over her children, her household, or her own daily movements. The palaces, the gowns, the title, they were not hers. They were the settings for a life she had not chosen and could not leave. The imperial nursery occupied a suite of rooms in the Hofburg designed a century earlier for Maria Theresa's children. High ceilings, tall windows that remained shuttered against drafts, rococo furniture too ornate for infants. Archduchess Sophie had selected every nurse, every governess, every detail of the daily routine. She visited each morning to inspect the children, give instructions, hold them while Elizabeth stood near the doorway waiting for permission to approach. Sophie Friederike, the eldest, was a small child prone to fevers. The doctors Sophie employed kept the nursery overheated, the windows sealed. Elizabeth asked if the children could be taken outside. Sophie said fresh air was dangerous for delicate constitutions. Elizabeth suggested dismissing one of the nurses who handled the baby roughly. Sophie said the woman came from an excellent family and had served the Habsburgs for 20 years. Every question Elizabeth raised was answered with a decision already made. The children were hers biologically. In every other sense, they belonged to their grandmother. Gisela, born in July 1856, was healthier, louder, more demanding. Elizabeth was permitted to visit the nursery twice daily, once in the morning after Sophie's inspection, once in the evening before the children were put to bed. The visits were brief. Nurses hovered, correcting how Elizabeth held the babies, suggesting she not disturb them too much, reminding her when the scheduled time had ended. Franz Joseph rarely visited the nursery. He saw his daughters at formal family gatherings, kissed them on the forehead, then returned to his paperwork. He told Elizabeth she worried too much, that his mother had raised him perfectly well, using the same methods. Elizabeth began spending longer hours in her apartments, refusing to attend court functions. She complained of headaches, fatigue, unnamed illnesses that kept her in bed. The court physicians, selected by Sophie, examined her and found nothing physically wrong. Sophie told Franz Joseph that his wife was temperamental, that young mothers often struggled with nervousness, that she would adjust once she matured. Franz Joseph visited Elizabeth's rooms in the evenings, sat beside her bed, asked what troubled her. She said she wanted to raise her own children. He said they were being raised beautifully by experts. In summer 1856, Franz Joseph planned a state visit to Hungary. The empire's eastern half had been restive since the failed revolution of 1848, and he needed to demonstrate Habsburg authority. Sophie suggested he bring Elizabeth and the children. A young empress with two small daughters would soften the imperial image, make the Hungarians see the dynasty as a family, rather than an occupying force. Elizabeth was 20, desperate to leave Vienna, willing to endure a political tour, if it meant time with her daughters. They traveled by boat down the Danube in late summer. Sophie came along with a staff of 40 servants, nurses for the children, ladies-in-waiting for Elizabeth. The public appearances were carefully staged, Elizabeth holding baby Gisela on a palace balcony in Buda, walking through crowds with 2-year-old Sophie, while Franz Joseph greeted Hungarian nobility. The crowds cheered. The newspapers wrote about the beautiful young empress and her charming daughters. For 2 weeks, Elizabeth was permitted to mother her children in public, while Sophie managed everything in private. On the return journey, both children developed fevers. Sophie blamed the Hungarian climate, the river air, Elizabeth's insistence on taking the girls outside. The court physicians were summoned when they returned to Vienna. Little Sophie's fever worsened. She stopped eating, cried through the night, developed a rash across her chest and face. The doctors diagnosed typhoid, though later some would say it was dysentery, or cholera, or simply the failure of a weak constitution. Elizabeth asked to stay in the nursery. Sophie said the empress should not be exposed to infection. Sophie Friederike died on May 29, 1857. She was 2 years old. Elizabeth was not in the room. She had been told the child was improving, that rest was more important than vigil, that the nurses would send word if anything changed. When the summons came, she ran through the palace hallways in her dressing gown, but the child had already stopped breathing. Sophie stood beside the small body, composed, directing servants to prepare the lying in state. She told Elizabeth that God had taken the child for his own purposes, that an empress must bear grief with dignity. The funeral was a state occasion. The tiny coffin was displayed in the Hofburg Chapel. Foreign dignitaries sent condolences. The Viennese court wore black for 6 months. Elizabeth sat through the ceremonies in silence, her face blank. Franz Joseph wept briefly during the Mass, then returned to work. Sophie organized the mourning rituals, the commemorative Masses, the charitable donations made in the child's name. She told Franz Joseph that Elizabeth needed another pregnancy quickly, that a new baby would ease her grief. Elizabeth blamed herself for the Hungarian trip. Sophie blamed her as well, though never directly. The implication was enough. A more cautious mother would not have exposed delicate children to foreign climates. Elizabeth began refusing to eat. She grew thinner, paler, spent days in her apartments with the curtains drawn. Franz Joseph did not know how to console her. He had been taught that grief was private, that duty continued regardless of personal loss. He told her they would have more children. She did not respond. Gisela survived the illness, but was kept under even stricter supervision. Elizabeth was allowed to see her daughter only during scheduled visits, still supervised by nurses, still controlled by Sophie. The Empress was 20 years old, with one living child she could not raise and one dead child she had not been permitted to save. The court whispered that she was unstable, that her Bavarian blood made her unsuitable for the rigors of imperial life, that Franz Joseph should have married Helene after all. In private, Elizabeth wrote letters to her mother in Bavaria describing the nursery arrangements, Sophie's control, her own helplessness. Ludovica wrote back advising patience, reminding her that she was empress and must endure what the position required. Elizabeth's sister Marie, who had married the King of Naples, sent similar counsel. Royal marriages were not about personal happiness. Elizabeth stopped writing letters. She understood that no one was coming to rescue her, that her family saw her marriage as a success, regardless of her misery. By autumn 1857, Elizabeth was pregnant again. Sophie was satisfied. Franz Joseph was hopeful. The court prepared for another birth, another child for the imperial nursery. Elizabeth said nothing. She had learned that her words changed nothing, that her children would be taken regardless of what she wanted. that her only value was biological. The pregnancy was different because everyone knew what was required. Not another daughter, a son, an heir, the future of the dynasty. Archduchess Sophie commissioned prayers at every major church in Vienna. Franz Joseph ordered celebrations prepared in advance pending the child's sex. Elizabeth, 20 years old and silent through most of her third pregnancy, understood that this child mattered in ways the girls had not. The labor began on August 21st, 1858, in the middle of a humid Viennese summer. It lasted 14 hours. Sophie was present, as she had been for the previous births, directing physicians and attendants. When the child emerged, male and breathing, the announcement was made before Elizabeth had been cleaned or moved from the birthing bed. Cannons fired across Vienna, church bells rang, crowds gathered outside the Hofburg to cheer for the crown prince. Franz Joseph wept with relief. Sophie smiled for the first time since her granddaughter's death. They named him Rudolph, after the first Habsburg king. Elizabeth held him briefly before he was taken to the nursery. She had expected this. What she had not expected was the shift in her position. For 3 days after the birth, dignitaries and foreign ambassadors requested audiences to congratulate the empress who had secured the succession. Sophie permitted the audiences. Franz Joseph publicly thanked his wife for giving him a son. The court, which had whispered about her instability after little Sophie's death, now praised her devotion to duty. Elizabeth believed briefly that producing the heir had earned her something. She requested that Rudolph be brought to her apartments each morning. Sophie agreed, then assigned 2 nurses to accompany the baby and remain throughout the visit. Elizabeth asked if the nursery routine could include more time outdoors. Sophie consulted the physicians, who agreed that brief walks in the palace gardens would be acceptable, supervised by staff. It was not what Elizabeth wanted, but it was more than she had been allowed with her daughters. She thought she was gaining ground. By November, 3 months after Rudolph's birth, the illusion collapsed. Sophie announced that the crown prince required a male governor to oversee his upbringing. She had selected Count Leopold Gondricourt, a military officer known for rigid discipline. Elizabeth said the child was an infant, that a governor was premature. Sophie explained that Habsburg heirs began their education from birth, that every moment of Rudolph's development must be carefully managed. Franz Joseph supported his mother. The empire needed a strong successor, raised without softness. Elizabeth was permitted to see Rudolph at scheduled times. The nurses reported his activities to Sophie, who adjusted his routine as she saw fit. When he cried during the night, Elizabeth was not informed. When he developed a fever at 6 months, she learned about it a day later. Gisela, now 2 years old, was moved to a separate section of the nursery with her own attendants. The sisters would be raised in proximity, but not together. Elizabeth saw both children during brief, supervised visits. She had given the empire an heir and remained powerless over all 3 of her children. The court expected her to be grateful. She was empress, mother of the crown prince, married to a man who loved her and gave her anything except autonomy. The palaces were hers to inhabit. The jewels were hers to wear. She had ladies-in-waiting, dressmakers, hairdressers, access to wealth that most of her Bavarian relatives could not imagine. What she did not have was the ability to enter the nursery unannounced, to dismiss a nurse she disliked, to decide when her son should be fed or where her daughters should sleep. Franz Joseph did not understand her unhappiness. He had been raised by tutors and governors, seen his mother only at formal times, and considered himself well-adjusted. When Elizabeth complained about the nursery arrangements, he reminded her that Sophie had raised 5 archdukes successfully. When she said she wanted more time with the children, he suggested she attend the scheduled visits more consistently instead of staying in her apartments. He could not see that the structure itself was the problem, that supervised visits were not motherhood. In 1859, war with France and Piedmont pulled Franz Joseph away from Vienna for months. He left Sophie in charge of the court and the imperial household. Elizabeth remained in the Hofburg with her 3 children floors away, managed by staff she had not chosen. She began refusing meals again, losing weight until her ladies-in-waiting reported to Sophie that the empress was too thin to safely wear her court gowns. Sophie ordered the kitchens to prepare food Elizabeth preferred, sent physicians to examine her, suggested she needed distractions from brooding. The distractions Sophie provided were controlled: chaperoned walks, attendance at court concerts, embroidery lessons with archduchesses who reported everything Elizabeth said. There was no privacy. Every room had servants. Every outing had attendants. Every conversation was observed. Elizabeth told one of her Bavarian ladies-in-waiting that she felt like an expensive ornament kept behind glass. The comment reached Sophie within hours. When Franz Joseph returned from the war in July 1859, defeated and forced to cede territory to Piedmont, he found his wife thinner, quieter, more withdrawn. He asked what troubled her. She said she wanted her children. He said she had them. She said she wanted to raise them herself. He said they were being raised by the best tutors and nurses in Europe. The conversation ended there. He could not comprehend that titles and wealth meant nothing if she had no control over her own life. Rudolph was a year old, beginning to walk, developing a personality his mother saw only in fragments. Gisela was 3, learning to read under a governess Sophie had selected. Both children called for their nurses when they were hurt or frightened, not for their mother. Elizabeth understood that she had been replaced by paid staff, that her biological role was complete and her presence was now optional. In autumn 1859, Elizabeth asked Franz Joseph if she could return to Bavaria for an extended visit. Sophie opposed the idea. Empresses did not leave their husbands for months at a time. Franz Joseph compromised. Elizabeth could visit Posenhofen for 3 weeks, accompanied by appropriate staff. She went in October, her first time away from the Hofburg for more than a few days since her marriage. Her family found her changed, thinner, harder, less willing to smile. She spent most of the visit riding horses through the woods alone, returning to the house only after dark. When she returned to Vienna in November, the children had grown in her absence. Rudolph had learned new words. Gisela barely remembered her. The nurses reported that the children had not asked for their mother. Elizabeth stood in the nursery doorway, watching her son play with blocks under Sophie's supervision, and understood that she had already lost them. Elizabeth began coughing in the winter of 1860, a persistent dry cough that worsened in the closed rooms of the Hofburg. The court physicians examined her and diagnosed a weakness of the lungs, possibly consumption, though later assessments would suggest nothing more than chronic bronchitis brought on by stress and the palace's poor ventilation. Sophie insisted the windows remain shut against winter cold. Elizabeth grew worse. By February, she was coughing blood. Franz Joseph, frightened by the possibility of losing his wife as he had lost his daughter, consulted specialists from across Europe. They recommended warm climate, sea air, complete rest away from Vienna. Sophie opposed the idea. Empresses did not disappear for months to recover from minor ailments, but the blood convinced Franz Joseph. He arranged for Elizabeth to travel to Madeira, a Portuguese island in the Atlantic where wealthy Europeans went to recover from respiratory illness. Elizabeth left Vienna in March 1860 with an entourage of 30 attendants, physicians, and ladies-in-waiting selected by Sophie. She did not take her children. Rudolph was 18 months old. Gisela was nearly 4. She kissed them goodbye in the nursery under Sophie's observation and departed for a place she had never seen to recover from an illness that may have been partially invented. The journey took 2 weeks by ship. She arrived in Madeira and stayed for 6 months. The island was warm, green, isolated from European court life. Elizabeth's attendants reported her activities back to Vienna, but the distance made Sophie's control less immediate. The Empress walked for hours along coastal paths, began riding horses again, ate when she chose rather than at scheduled court mealtimes. The cough improved within weeks. The physicians recommended she return to Vienna. Elizabeth said she was not ready. She stayed through the summer, sending letters to Franz Joseph describing her health, but rarely mentioning their children. When she finally returned to Vienna in August 1860, the children had been without their mother for 5 months. Rudolph did not recognize her. Gisela was polite but distant, trained by then to seek comfort from nurses and governesses, rather than a woman who appeared intermittently. Elizabeth resumed her scheduled visits to the nursery, sitting with children who treated her like a formal acquaintance. Franz Joseph was relieved to have her home. Sophie was satisfied that the Empress had recovered and could resume her ceremonial duties. But Elizabeth had learned something in Madeira. Absence was possible. Illness, real or exaggerated, provided escape. Within months of returning, she began complaining of other ailments: headaches, nervous exhaustion, weakness that kept her in her apartments or required travel to spas for treatment. The physicians, uncertain whether her symptoms were physical or psychological, recommended rest, warm baths, mineral waters. Franz Joseph, worried and confused, granted every request. Sophie suspected malingering, but could not prove it. In 1861, Elizabeth traveled to Bad Kissingen in Bavaria for a 6-week cure. She returned to Vienna for 3 months, then left for Corfu. The pattern established itself. Brief periods in Vienna, longer periods away, always with medical justification. She was present for state functions when absolutely required. Formal dinners, important ceremonies, visits from foreign royalty. The rest of the time she was recovering somewhere else. The children grew up in her absence. Rudolf turned 3, then 4, managed entirely by Count Gondricourt and a staff of tutors. The Count believed in military discipline for young boys. Rudolf was woken at 5 each morning, dressed in a miniature uniform, subjected to drills and exercises designed to harden him. When the child cried, Gondricourt had him doused with cold water. When he showed fear during hunting lessons, he was locked in a room until he calmed himself. Elizabeth heard rumors of the Count's methods from sympathetic ladies-in-waiting, but was in Corfu when Rudolf's education intensified. She wrote letters to Franz Joseph expressing concern. He replied that the Crown Prince needed strength, not coddling. Gisela, approaching school age, was given governesses who taught her French, music, embroidery, and the elaborate protocol required of an archduchess. She was a quiet child, obedient, careful not to cause trouble. She saw her mother during Elizabeth's brief stays in Vienna and learned not to expect consistency. When Elizabeth was present, she occasionally brought Gisela to her apartments, had her sit quietly while the Empress had her hair arranged, a process that took hours, or read to her briefly before sending her back to the nursery. The affection was sporadic, insufficient to build attachment. Elizabeth turned 25 in 1862. She had been married 8 years and spent nearly half that time away from Vienna. Her beauty had become her occupation. She rose at 5 each morning to have her hair washed, brushed, braided into elaborate styles that required 3 hours to complete. She ate almost nothing: beef broth, oranges, occasionally a piece of lean meat. Her waist, naturally small, was corseted down to 19 inches, then 18. She exercised obsessively, installing gymnastic equipment in her private rooms, performing routines that left her ladies-in-waiting exhausted from watching. The beauty rituals were not vanity. They were control. Sophie managed her children, Franz Joseph managed the empire, court protocol managed her public appearances, but her body was hers to discipline. She weighed herself multiple times daily. She recorded every meal. When she gained a pound, she fasted for days. Her hair, famously long and thick, became a project that consumed hours. She would not allow it to be cut, would not permit hair pieces or alterations. The hairdresser who tended it became one of the few people she trusted. She also began riding with intensity that alarmed her attendants. She hunted in England, Ireland, anywhere with challenging terrain and dangerous jumps. She rode recklessly, taking fences other riders avoided, pushing horses to their limits. Franz Joseph begged her to be more careful. She ignored him. The riding was freedom, risk, the possibility of injury or death without the shame of deliberate self-harm. When she returned from a hunt with bruises or a twisted ankle, she seemed more alive than she did sitting through court dinners. In 1863, Elizabeth insisted on taking Rudolf riding. He was 5 years old, small for his age, nervous around horses after Gondricourt's harsh training methods. Elizabeth put him on a pony and led him through the palace gardens. He cried, afraid of falling. She told him he was a Habsburg and must be brave. The riding lesson lasted 20 minutes before Rudolf begged to stop. Elizabeth sent him back to his governor, disappointed. She wanted her son to love what she loved, but he had been shaped by people she had allowed to raise him. Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant again in late 1867. She was 30 years old, had not shared Franz Joseph's bed regularly in years, and had avoided another pregnancy through careful timing and frequent absences from Vienna. But a brief reconciliation during a stay at Gödöllő, the Hungarian palace Franz Joseph had given her, resulted in a 4th child. Sophie was pleased. More children secured the dynasty. Franz Joseph was hopeful that motherhood might settle his wife. Elizabeth said nothing publicly. In private, she told her Hungarian lady-in-waiting that this child would not be taken from her. The pregnancy coincided with the political transformation of the empire. The Compromise of 1867 created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, giving the Hungarian half-significant autonomy. Elizabeth had developed a fascination with Hungary, its language, its nobility, its resistance to Habsburg control. The Hungarians, in turn, saw her as an ally against Viennese conservatism. She studied their language obsessively, surrounded herself with Hungarian attendants, spent months at Gödöllő away from Sophie's supervision. When she gave birth in April 1868, she was in Budapest, not Vienna. The child was a girl. They named her Marie Valerie. Elizabeth was determined that this daughter would belong to her, not to Sophie. She refused to allow the baby to be taken to the imperial nursery. She dismissed the Viennese nurses Sophie tried to install and hired Hungarian women she selected herself. When Sophie insisted that the child be brought to Vienna for proper care, Elizabeth refused. She kept Marie Valerie with her in Hungary, supervised her feeding, her sleep, her daily routine. For the first time in 13 years of marriage, Elizabeth was raising her own child. Sophie protested to Franz Joseph. An empress could not reject court protocol, could not choose her own staff without approval, could not raise an archduchess without proper Viennese supervision. Franz Joseph, exhausted by years of his wife's illnesses and absences, made a concession he had never made before. He told his mother that Marie Valerie would remain with Elizabeth. Sophie, aging and no longer as dominant at court, accepted the decision with visible displeasure. Elizabeth had won, but only because she had a fourth child to fight over. The victory came with a cost no one calculated immediately. Rudolph was 9 years old when his youngest sister was born. Gisela was 12. Both children had been raised by staff, seen their mother intermittently, learned to function without parental attachment. Now their mother, who had been largely absent from their lives, was intensely present for a baby sister. Elizabeth brought Marie Valerie everywhere, held her during audiences, kept her in her apartments, focused on her with an attention the older children had never received. Rudolph noticed. He was old enough to understand that his mother had chosen to be absent, that her illnesses had been excuses, that she could have stayed if she had wanted to. He asked his tutors why the Empress lived in Hungary with his sister instead of in Vienna with him. They had no answer that would not indict her. He stopped asking. Gisela, quieter and more resigned, simply accepted that her mother preferred the baby. She had already learned that expecting affection led to disappointment. Elizabeth's attachment to Marie Valerie became obsessive. She called the child the only one, wrote in her diary that Marie Valerie was the only person she loved without reservation, kept her close in a way that prevented the girl from developing independence. Marie Valerie was not permitted to play with other children without supervision. She was taught Hungarian before German, raised with Hungarian attendants, told repeatedly that she was special, chosen, beloved in ways her siblings were not. The possessiveness was not maternal love. It was ownership disguised as devotion. Elizabeth had been denied control over her first 3 children, so she controlled the fourth absolutely. Marie Valerie became an extension of her mother's will, kept in Hungary to spite Sophie, educated according to Elizabeth's preferences, used as justification for avoiding Vienna. The child was loved, but she was also a tool. In 1869, Elizabeth took Marie Valerie to Possenhofen to visit the Bavarian relatives. Rudolph and Gisela remained in Vienna. Elizabeth stayed in Bavaria for 2 months, writing letters to Franz Joseph about their youngest daughter's development, but mentioning the older children only in passing. When she returned to Vienna briefly that autumn, Rudolph was 10 and increasingly isolated. His education under Gondricourt had made him anxious, intellectually curious, but socially awkward. He wanted his mother's attention. She spent their time together talking about Marie Valerie. Gisela, at 13, had learned to expect nothing. She was being prepared for marriage, taught the skills required of a Habsburg bride. Her education focused on languages, deportment, the management of households she would oversee once she was married off to secure an alliance. Elizabeth took little interest in Gisela's education. When they were in the same palace, they saw each other at formal dinners. Elizabeth did not ask about her daughter's studies, her interests, her feelings about the marriage that everyone knew was being arranged. Knew was by 1870, Marie Valerie was 2 years old and still sleeping in her mother's apartments. Elizabeth refused to move her to a nursery. She refused to allow governesses she had not personally approved. She refused to follow any routine that separated her from the child for more than a few hours. The court whispered that the Empress had become unbalanced, that her attachment to the youngest daughter was unhealthy. Sophie, vindicated in her earlier concerns about Elizabeth's stability, said nothing publicly, but ensured that Rudolf and Gisella's education continued under proper Viennese supervision. Franz Joseph visited his youngest daughter when Elizabeth permitted it. She did not permit it often. She told him that Marie Valerie needed routine, that too many visitors upset her, that the child was delicate and required her mother's constant presence. He accepted this, as he had accepted everything else. He had his heir, his eldest daughter was being prepared for a suitable marriage, and his wife was occupied with motherhood instead of disappearing to foreign spas. The arrangement seemed functional. What no one acknowledged was that Elizabeth's devotion to Marie Valerie was another form of absence. She was physically present with one child while emotionally abandoning the other three. Rudolf grew up watching his mother lavish attention on a sister while offering him nothing but brief, formal interactions. Gisela grew up understanding that she had been born second, and therefore mattered less. Both children learned that their mother's love was not something they could earn. It had been given to someone else completely and exclusively before they were old enough to compete for it. Elizabeth had not been present when her first daughter died. She had been sleeping in another wing of the Hofburg, told the child was recovering, kept away by Sophie and the court physicians, who believed the Empress should not be exposed to fever. When 2-year-old Sophie died in May 1857, Elizabeth ran through the palace corridors too late. The child was already gone. For years afterward, Elizabeth spoke of the death as a defining tragedy. She wore mourning jewelry with Sophie's hair woven into bracelets. She commissioned portraits of the child from memory. She wrote poems about loss, about a daughter taken too soon, about maternal grief that nothing could repair. The court saw a mother devastated by death. What they did not see was that Elizabeth had been largely absent during the child's short life. Sophie Friederike had lived for 2 years under her grandmother's supervision in the imperial nursery. Elizabeth had visited at scheduled times, held the child briefly, then returned to her apartments or left Vienna entirely for health treatments. When the family traveled to Hungary in 1857, Elizabeth had gone because Sophie suggested it, because the trip offered an escape from Viennese court routine, not because she had demanded time with her daughters. The journey that exposed little Sophie to the illness that killed her had been Elizabeth's first extended period with her children. The child had died during one of the rare moments when her mother was actually present. The guilt should have been obvious. Elizabeth had not insisted on raising her daughter. She had not fought Sophie's control of the nursery. She had accepted the removal of her children with complaints, but no action. When little Sophie became ill, Elizabeth had deferred to the physicians and nurses, trusted them when they said the fever was manageable, and left the nursery when told she should rest. The child had died because Elizabeth trusted the same people who had taken her children in the first place. But Elizabeth did not frame the death as a consequence of her own passivity. She framed it as victimization. Sophie, the Archduchess, had controlled the nursery. Sophie had insisted on the Hungarian trip. Sophie had selected the doctors who failed to save the child. In Elizabeth's retelling, she became the grieving mother denied access to her dying daughter by a controlling mother-in-law. The narrative was not entirely false, but it omitted her own failures. The absences, the lack of resistance, the willingness to leave her children with people she did not trust. The death became useful. It justified her later obsession with Marie Valerie. She had lost one daughter and would not lose another. It explained her absences from Rudolf and Gisela. Grief had made her unable to mother properly. It provided moral weight to her suffering, transforming her unhappiness from privileged discontent into genuine tragedy. Viennese society, which had criticized her for avoiding court duties, softened. A mother who had lost a child deserved sympathy. Franz Joseph never questioned her version of events. He had been absent during most of little Sophie's life, focused on military matters and administration. He had not been in the room when she died either. His own grief was brief and private. He accepted Elizabeth's prolonged mourning as natural maternal feeling and did not ask why she had spent so little time with the daughter she now claimed to have loved so deeply. Rudolf and Gisela learned about their dead sister through their mother's theatrics. Elizabeth spoke of Sophie in their presence, always with dramatic sorrow, treating the dead child as more real than the living ones. Rudolf, raised on the story of the sister who died before he was born, understood that his mother valued absence more than presence. Gisela heard herself compared unfavorably to a ghost. Sophie had been delicate, beautiful, perfect in ways Gisela could never match, because she had the disadvantage of being alive and therefore flawed. The anniversary of Sophie's death became an annual ritual. Elizabeth observed it with private masses, hours spent alone in her apartments, refusal to attend court functions. The household adjusted around her mourning. Franz Joseph gave orders that she not be disturbed. Sophie, the Archduchess, attended the commemorative masses, but showed less emotion than her daughter-in-law, which the court interpreted as coldness, rather than recognizing that the grandmother's grief might be more complicated than public performance. In 1870, 13 years after Sophie's death, Elizabeth was still observing the anniversary with the same intensity. She was in Hungary with Marie Valerie when May 29th arrived. She spent the day in her apartments, refused meals, wrote poetry about her lost daughter. Rudolf was 12 years old in Vienna, preparing for exams with his tutors. Gisela was 14, learning to dance for the court balls, where she would soon be displayed to potential suitors. Neither child received letters from their mother on the dead sister's anniversary. Marie Valerie, 2 years old, was kept close while Elizabeth wept over a child who had been dead longer than Marie Valerie had been alive. The mourning was self-indulgent, but it was also strategic. It gave Elizabeth a permanent excuse for her absences, her refusals, her detachment from the children she had not lost. She could invoke Sophie's death to explain why she could not bear formal dinners, why she needed to travel for her health, why she kept Marie Valerie so close. She had already lost one daughter, and her nerves could not withstand the risk of loss again. No one could argue with a mother's grief, even when the grief served purposes beyond sorrow. What Elizabeth never admitted, perhaps even to herself, was that she had learned from little Sophie's death that absence had no real consequences. The child had died while Elizabeth was in the palace, surrounded by doctors and nurses and the full resources of the Habsburg court. If her presence could not prevent death, then her absence could not be blamed for it. She had been there, and the child had died anyway. The lesson was clear. Being present changed nothing. Rudolf, old enough by adolescence to recognize the pattern, began to understand that his mother used tragedy as currency. She spent the grief lavishly, wrote about it, performed it, but never examined what she might have done differently. She had not demanded control of the nursery after Sophie's death. She had simply blamed others for the loss. She had not changed her behavior with Rudolf and Gisela. She had continued leaving them in Vienna while she traveled. The only thing that changed was Marie Valerie, and that obsession had less to do with preventing another death than with winning a battle against Sophie over possession of a child. The dead daughter remained more important than the living ones because the dead daughter required nothing. She could be mourned without responsibility, loved without presence, memorialized without the messy reality of actual motherhood. Sophie Friederike, frozen at age 2, became perfect in death in ways her siblings could never achieve in life. Gisela turned 16 in 1872. She was old enough to marry, which meant she was old enough to be useful. Habsburg archduchesses did not choose their husbands. They were deployed like treaty signatures, sent to foreign courts to cement alliances or repair damaged relationships. Gisela had known this since childhood. What she had not known was how quickly her mother would arrange it. Elizabeth selected Prince Leopold of Bavaria as Gisela's husband. He was the second son of Prince Regent Luitpold, part of the Wittelsbach family Elizabeth had been born into. The match served Elizabeth's purposes. It tied Gisela to Bavaria, where Elizabeth still felt more comfortable than in Vienna, and it removed her eldest daughter from Sophie's influence. Whether Gisela wanted to marry Leopold was not discussed. Whether Leopold had any affection for the awkward, quiet 16-year-old was irrelevant. The negotiations took place in early 1873. Gisela was informed of the engagement after the arrangements had been finalized. She met her fiancé twice before the wedding, brief, formal encounters where they exchanged pleasantries under supervision. Leopold was 27, a military officer with no particular distinction. He needed a wife to secure his position within the Bavarian court. Gisela needed to fulfill the only function expected of her. Both understood the transaction. Elisabeth did not ask her daughter if she approved of the match. She told Gisela that marriage to a Bavarian prince would give her freedom from the Viennese court, that she would be closer to Possenhofen, that the Wittelsbach family was less rigid than the Habsburgs. Everything Elisabeth said was technically true. What she did not say was that Gisela was being sent away at 16 to live with a man she did not know, in a marriage designed to benefit everyone except the bride. The wedding took place in April 1873 at the Augustiner Kirche, the same church where Elisabeth had married Franz Joseph 19 years earlier. Gisela wore white as required. Elisabeth attended, elegant and composed, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that had taken 4 hours. Franz Joseph walked his daughter down the aisle. Archduchess Sophie watched from the front pew, satisfied that another generation of dynastic duty was being fulfilled. Rudolph, 15, attended in his military uniform. Marie Valerie, 5 years old, stayed in Hungary with her attendants. Gisela was pale throughout the ceremony. She spoke her vows clearly, as she had been taught. Leopold spoke his with equal formality. They knelt for the blessing, stood for the pronouncement, walked back down the aisle as husband and wife without looking at each other. The reception was crowded with Bavarian and Austrian nobility, diplomats, relatives from both families. Gisela sat beside her new husband at the head table and said almost nothing. Elisabeth left the reception early, citing a headache. She returned to her apartments while her daughter was still greeting guests. She did not say goodbye to Gisela privately. She did not offer advice or comfort or acknowledgement that she was sending her 16-year-old daughter into exactly the kind of arranged marriage Elisabeth herself had despised. The parallel was obvious. Elisabeth ignored it. Gisela moved to Munich immediately after the wedding. She wrote letters to her father describing her new household, her duties as Leopold's wife, the Bavarian court functions she was required to attend. The letters were dutiful, detailed, empty of feeling. Franz Joseph wrote back occasionally with news from Vienna. Elisabeth did not write at all for the first 3 months of Gisela's marriage. When she finally sent a letter, it was brief. She hoped Gisela was well. She was busy with Marie Valerie. She might visit Bavaria later in the year. The visit never happened. Elisabeth spent the summer of 1873 in Bad Ischl, then traveled to England for the hunting season. Gisela, pregnant with her first child by autumn, received a short note of congratulation. The baby, a daughter named Elisabeth, was born in January 1874. Elisabeth, the grandmother, did not visit. She sent gifts, expensive, impersonal items selected by attendants. Gisela named the child after her mother anyway, a gesture of loyalty or obligation that went unacknowledged. Leopold was not cruel to Gisela, but he was not affectionate. He had married her for the connection to the Austrian imperial family, for the dowry, for the social advancement. He kept mistresses, as Bavarian princes were expected to do. He spent his evenings at his club or with military colleagues. Gisela managed the household, bore children, 4 in total, over 10 years, and learned that marriage meant organized loneliness. She did not complain. Complaints required someone to listen, and Gisela had learned from childhood that her feelings were not important enough to voice. Her father was occupied with the empire. Her mother was occupied with Marie Valerie. Her grandmother Sophie had grown old and distant. Rudolph, her only sibling close to her age, was trapped in his own unhappiness in Vienna. Gisela wrote polite letters, attended required functions, and raised her children with the same quiet resignation she had learned from being raised by governesses. Elisabeth visited Munich occasionally, staying in the city for a few days before continuing to other destinations. During these visits, she saw Gisela briefly, dinners where they sat at opposite ends of a table crowded with relatives, afternoon teas interrupted by other obligations. Elisabeth brought Marie Valerie, now a girl of 7 or 8, and focused her attention on the younger daughter. Gisela's children were greeted politely, then ignored. The message was clear. Gisela had fulfilled her duty by marrying and producing heirs. Elisabeth's interest in her had ended. By 1880, Gisela was 24 years old with 3 children and a fourth pregnancy. She had been married 7 years to a man who treated her with formal courtesy and nothing more. She lived in Munich, close enough to visit her Bavarian relatives, but not close enough to matter to her mother, who spent most of her time in Hungary or traveling to English estates for fox hunting. Gisela had become exactly what Elizabeth had been at her age, a woman married young to secure an alliance, raising children in isolation, performing duties without complaint. The difference was that Elizabeth had rebelled, however ineffectively. She had traveled, refused court functions, made her unhappiness visible. Gisela did none of these things. She had watched her mother's rebellion achieve nothing except the right to be absent, and she had learned that rebellion was pointless. Instead, she endured. She managed her household, attended masses, wrote letters no one answered, and raised her children with the mechanical competence of someone who had never been mothered herself. Elizabeth had arranged the marriage that imprisoned her daughter, then abandoned her to it. She had replicated the pattern that had damaged her, justified it as freedom from Viennese court rigidity, and moved on without acknowledging what she had done. Gisela understood this, but understanding changed nothing. She was married, a mother, trapped in the same cycle, and her own mother, who could have prevented it, was somewhere else, with the daughter she actually loved. Rudolph was 7 years old when Count Gondricourt was finally dismissed. The removal came not from Elizabeth, who had been in Hungary and England during the worst of the Count's methods, but from Franz Joseph, who received a report that his son had been found trembling in a locked room after being confined there for hours as punishment. The emperor, who had approved the harsh discipline, suddenly decided it had gone too far. Gondricourt was replaced with Colonel Joseph Latour von Thurmberg, a military man with gentler methods but no more understanding of how to raise a sensitive, intelligent child. The damage had been done. Rudolph at 7 was nervous, prone to nightmares, afraid of sudden noises. He had been woken before dawn for years, subjected to cold water treatments meant to toughen him, trained to suppress crying, locked away when he showed fear. The methods were designed to create a strong emperor. They created a frightened boy who learned to hide his feelings behind rigid composure. Elizabeth, when she finally returned to Vienna for an extended stay in 1866, took sudden interest in her son's education. She had been absent during the years of his harshest treatment, but she blamed Sophie for choosing Gondricourt and Franz Joseph for approving him. She did not blame herself for leaving. She announced that Rudolph's education needed reform, that he was being raised to be narrow-minded and militaristic, that he needed exposure to liberal ideas and modern thought. She chose his next tutor herself, Joseph Brecht, a liberal Catholic with progressive views on science, politics, and social reform. Franz Joseph reluctantly agreed, wanting to please his wife during one of her rare periods of presence in Vienna. Sophie objected. Liberal tutors would fill the crown prince's head with dangerous ideas. Elizabeth dismissed her mother-in-law's concerns. For once, she would control something in her children's lives. Brecht arrived when Rudolph was 8 and immediately introduced the boy to ideas that contradicted everything he had been taught. Where Gondricourt had emphasized obedience and military discipline, Brecht taught critical thinking. Where the earlier tutors had presented the Habsburg monarchy as divinely ordained, Brecht discussed constitutional government and the rights of citizens. Where Rudolph had been taught that empire meant control, Brecht suggested it might mean responsibility to the governed. Rudolph absorbed it all desperately. He was intelligent, curious, starved for intellectual stimulation. He asked questions his tutors could not answer. He read books Brecht recommended: Darwin, Mill, contemporary political philosophy. He began forming opinions about the empire his father governed, most of them critical. At 9 years old, he told his tutor that the monarchy's treatment of its Hungarian and Slavic populations was unjust. At 10, he questioned whether hereditary rule made sense in a modern world. Franz Joseph learned of his son's opinions and was disturbed. He had wanted Rudolph educated, not radicalized. But Elizabeth supported Brecht, so the tutor remained. Sophie complained that the crown prince was being turned against his own class. Elizabeth said her son was learning to think. No one asked Rudolph what he wanted, which was impossible. He wanted his education to mean something, but he was being raised for a role that would give him no power to implement what he learned. The contradictions multiplied. Franz Joseph took Rudolf to military reviews and expected him to show enthusiasm for Austria's armed forces. Rudolf attended dutifully, then returned to Brecht's lessons about the human cost of war. Sophie arranged for Rudolf to meet conservative aristocrats who would reinforce traditional Habsburg values. Rudolf listened politely, then discussed with his tutor why aristocratic privilege was indefensible. Elisabeth encouraged his liberal thinking when she was present, then left for months at a time, making clear that intellectual ideas mattered less than her own freedom. By adolescence, Rudolf was trapped between three competing visions of what he should become. His father wanted a traditional emperor who would maintain Habsburg power. His grandmother wanted a pious, conservative defender of aristocratic order. His mother wanted a modern, enlightened monarch who would reform the empire, but she had no practical advice for how such reforms could be accomplished, and her own life suggested that imperial duty was something to escape rather than embrace. Rudolf tried to please all of them and satisfied none. He attended Mass to appease Sophie, studied military strategy to please his father, read progressive political theory to earn his mother's approval. He became skilled at performance, at presenting different versions of himself depending on who was watching. The effort exhausted him. He developed chronic headaches, stomach problems, insomnia. The physicians prescribed rest. There was no rest available for a crown prince whose identity was being constructed by committee. At 14, Rudolf wrote essays about reforming the empire's bureaucracy, improving conditions for industrial workers, granting autonomy to ethnic minorities. His tutors praised the work. Franz Joseph read the essays and said nothing. Elisabeth, when shown them during a brief visit to Vienna, said they were excellent and then left for England without discussing them further. Rudolf understood that his ideas were academic exercises, not preparations for actual governance. His father would rule for decades. By the time Rudolf inherited, he would be middle-aged, and whatever vision he had would have been compromised by years of waiting. The isolation intensified. Rudolf had no real friends. Other aristocratic boys his age were being raised in similar isolation, tutored privately, discouraged from forming close bonds that might complicate future political arrangements. He saw his father at formal dinners and official functions. He saw his mother unpredictably during her occasional stays in Vienna, always with Marie Valerie in tow. His sister Gisela had married and left. His grandmother Sophie was aging, less involved in court affairs. The tutors were employees, not companions. Rudolf was surrounded by people and profoundly alone. He began keeping journals, writing compulsively about his thoughts, frustrations, doubts. The journals were private, hidden from servants and tutors. In them, he questioned everything he had been taught to accept: the value of monarchy, the justice of aristocratic privilege, the purpose of his own existence. He wrote about feeling trapped in a role he had not chosen, in a family that did not understand him, in an empire he was supposed to inherit but could not imagine ruling. At 16, he was introduced to adult court life, formal dinners, state receptions, ceremonies where he represented the future of the dynasty. He performed well. He had been trained since birth to stand correctly, speak appropriately, show no emotion, but the performance required increasing effort. He started drinking wine at dinners, more than was appropriate for his age. He complained of headaches that lasted for days. He asked his tutors questions that had no answers. What was the point of learning about justice if he would inherit a system built on injustice? What good was education if power would come from birth rather than merit? No one had answers because the questions revealed the fundamental contradiction of Rudolf's existence. He had been raised to be intelligent enough to recognize the problems with hereditary monarchy, but not free enough to reject it. Elisabeth turned 40 in 1877. She marked the occasion by weighing herself 3 times and recording that she had gained half a pound. The gain required immediate correction, a week of consuming nothing but pressed orange juice and egg whites. Her waist, which she measured daily, had expanded from 17.5 inches to 17 3/4. The corset was tightened until she could barely breathe. By the end of the week, the measurements were acceptable again. The regime had been in place for years, but it intensified as she aged. She woke at 5 each morning for exercise, gymnastic rings installed in her private apartments, routines that lasted 2 hours. Breakfast was beef tea or thin broth. Lunch was avoided entirely. Dinner, when she could not escape it, consisted of meat juice pressed from raw beef, occasionally a piece of lean venison. She consumed violet candies soaked in sugar as her only indulgence, then compensated by fasting the following day. Her ladies-in-waiting watched her grow thinner. At 5 feet 8 inches tall, she weighed less than 100 pounds by her early 40s. Her face, still beautiful, had lost the softness of youth. The cheekbones were sharp, the eyes larger in a narrowing face. She looked elegant in photographs, ethereal in court portraits. In person, she looked skeletal. The court physicians warned Franz Joseph that his wife's health was at risk. He asked her to eat more. She told him she felt perfectly well. The hair rituals consumed 3 hours daily. Her hairdresser, Fanny Fafelick, washed the heavy dark mass, brushed it until it shone, then arranged it in elaborate braids pinned close to her head. Elisabeth would not permit a single hair to be cut. When strands fell out during brushing, a natural occurrence, she demanded Fanny account for each one. If too many hairs were lost, Elisabeth grew agitated, convinced she was going bald. She commissioned tonics, special treatments, anything that might preserve what she considered her most valuable asset. The beauty maintenance was not preparation for public life. Elisabeth avoided court functions whenever possible. She attended state dinners only when Franz Joseph insisted, and then she sat in silence, eating nothing, leaving as soon as protocol permitted. The beauty was for herself, or perhaps for no one. It was control made visible, proof that she could discipline her body into submission, even as everything else in her life remained beyond her authority. In 1873, the Vienna stock market collapsed. The crash triggered economic crisis across the empire, bank failures, factory closures, unemployment that spread through industrial centers. By 1875, hunger was common in working-class districts of Vienna. Charitable organizations distributed bread to families who had nothing else. The crisis lasted years, deepening as agricultural failures compounded industrial decline. Elisabeth was aware of the crisis in abstract terms. She read newspapers, heard discussions at court. She knew people were suffering. Her response was to commission more elaborate riding costumes and plan extended trips to England, where the hunting was better than anything available in Austria. She spent months at English country estates, riding with aristocrats who were equally insulated from the economic collapse affecting their lower classes. The cost of maintaining her traveling household, attendants, horses, lodging, could have fed hundreds of Viennese families for months. She did not make the connection, or she made it and dismissed it. The suffering of people she would never meet was abstract. The tightness of her corset was immediate. The condition of her hair mattered more than the condition of the empire, because she could control one and not the other. When charitable organizations requested her patronage, she declined. When Franz Joseph suggested she make public appearances to demonstrate imperial concern for the crisis, she said her health would not permit it. The health excuses had become routine. Elisabeth complained of sciatica, neuralgia, rheumatism, mysterious pains that required treatments at expensive spas. She traveled to Carlsbad, Gastein, Kissingen, places where European aristocracy went to recover from ailments that were often more social than medical. The treatments involved mineral baths, massage, elaborate dietary regimens, supervised by fashionable doctors. Elisabeth submitted to all of it, then returned to her private fasting and exercise routines that negated whatever health benefits the spas might have provided. In 1878, while economic hardship continued across the empire, Elisabeth commissioned a private villa in Corfu. She had fallen in love with the Greek island during earlier travels, enchanted by its climate and distance from Vienna. The villa, called the Achillean, was designed in neoclassical style with gardens, statues, views of the sea. The cost was enormous. The construction took years. Elisabeth supervised every detail, the placement of columns, the selection of marble, the landscaping that would create a private paradise. She filled the villa with statues of Achilles, the Greek hero she romanticized as a fellow sufferer. She identified with his rage, his isolation, his death at the height of his beauty. She wrote poetry comparing herself to him, drawing parallels between his fate and her own. The comparison required ignoring that Achilles died in battle while she lived in luxury, that his suffering came from war, while hers came from having everything except autonomy. The self-pity was extravagant, but no one confronted it. Marie Valerie, now 10 years old, accompanied her mother to Corfu and to the English estates. The girl was being raised in transit, educated by tutors who traveled with them, kept close to Elizabeth at all times. She had no friends her own age. Her world consisted of her mother's attendants, and the changing locations they inhabited. Elizabeth called this giving her daughter freedom from Viennese constraints. It was actually isolation dressed as privilege. Rudolf, approaching 20, remained in Vienna preparing for military service and ceremonial duties. He wrote letters to his mother in Corfu describing his studies, his readings, his thoughts on political matters. She responded rarely and briefly. Gisela, married with children in Munich, received even less attention. Both understood that their mother's love was reserved for Marie Valerie and for her own carefully maintained appearance. The contrast between Elizabeth's self-absorption and the empire's suffering became more visible as the economic crisis persisted. While workers queued for bread, the Empress ordered custom riding boots from London. While families lost their homes to foreclosure, she commissioned new gymnastic equipment for her private apartments. While charitable organizations struggled to fund basic relief, she spent months at luxury spas treating imaginary illnesses. She was not deliberately cruel. Cruelty requires attention to the suffering of others. Elizabeth was simply indifferent. The people starving in Vienna were as remote to her as the servants who dressed her each morning, present but not visible as individuals with their own needs and pain. Her world had narrowed to her body, her daughter Marie Valerie, and her escapes from Vienna. Everything else was background, necessary for maintaining her position, but irrelevant to her emotional life. Rudolf turned 21 in 1879 and was immediately married. The bride was Princess Stephanie of Belgium, 15 years old, selected by Franz Joseph and approved by the Habsburg court because her father, King Leopold II, had wealth and influence. Rudolf met her 3 times before the wedding. He found her pleasant enough but intellectually limited, shaped by a convent education that had taught her embroidery and prayer, but nothing about politics, literature, or the ideas that occupied Rudolf's mind. The marriage was announced in March, celebrated in May. Stephanie arrived in Vienna wearing white, terrified of her new husband and the imperial court. Rudolf performed his duties at the wedding with mechanical precision, spoke his vows, kissed his bride's hand, smiled for the crowds. He was 21 years old, being given a teenage wife he barely knew to produce heirs who would continue a dynasty he increasingly doubted had any right to exist. Elizabeth attended the wedding but left the reception early. She found Stephanie boring, told her ladies-in-waiting that the girl had no personality. She did not consider that her son was being subjected to exactly the arrangement that had destroyed her own happiness. Married young to someone chosen by others, expected to produce children, trapped in a role defined before birth. She went back to Godolo with Marie Valerie the day after the ceremony. The marriage failed immediately. Stephanie tried to be a good wife in the only way she understood, submissive, pious, focused on household management. Rudolf wanted intellectual companionship, someone who could discuss philosophy and politics, someone who understood his frustration with the rigid conservatism of the Habsburg court. Instead, he had a girl who prayed for hours and embroidered altar cloths. Within months, they were sleeping in separate apartments. Stephanie became pregnant quickly, gave birth to a daughter in 1883. Rudolf had wanted a son, not from preference, but because producing a male heir was his primary function. The daughter, Elizabeth Marie, was healthy but useless from a dynastic perspective. Franz Joseph was disappointed. Archduchess Sophie, declining in health, expressed hope that there would be other pregnancies. Rudolf stopped visiting his wife's bedroom. At 24, he had fulfilled the minimum requirement of marriage and saw no reason to continue pretending affection. He turned to other women, aristocrats who understood discretion, actresses who expected payment. The affairs were numerous, joyless, conducted with the same mechanical efficiency he brought to court ceremonies. He drank more, wine at dinner, brandy afterward, enough to blur the edges of perpetual dissatisfaction. His health, never robust, deteriorated. He suffered migraines that lasted days, digestive problems, insomnia. The physicians prescribed morphine for the headaches. Rudolf discovered it also helped with sleep, with anxiety, with the relentless awareness that his life had no purpose beyond waiting for his father to die. Franz Joseph, still vigorous in his 50s, showed no sign of declining. He worked 12-hour days, maintained strict routines, governed the empire with the same methodical attention to detail he had employed for 30 years. Rudolf watched his father sign documents, attend military reviews, host diplomatic receptions, and understood that this would continue for decades. He was crown prince, heir to an empire, and completely powerless. His liberal ideas meant nothing. His education meant nothing. He existed to inherit, and inheritance required his father's death, a death Rudolf could not wish for without guilt, but could not stop anticipating. He began writing again, more obsessively than in adolescence. Anonymous articles appeared in liberal newspapers criticizing Habsburg policy, advocating for democratic reforms, questioning the sustainability of monarchical rule. The articles were intelligent, well-argued, seditious. Rudolf published them under pseudonyms, aware that if his authorship became known, it would constitute a form of treason. Writing was the only outlet he had for political thought. It changed nothing. The articles were read by people who had no power to implement reforms in an empire where meaningful change required imperial approval that would never come. Elizabeth visited Vienna occasionally, saw her son at formal dinners, noticed he looked unwell. She suggested he travel more, take up writing seriously, find activities that would distract him from brooding. She did not ask what he was brooding about. She did not offer to listen or to help navigate the contradictions she had helped create by giving him liberal tutors while offering no path toward liberal action. She returned to Corfu or England, leaving Rudolf to manage his unhappiness alone. By his mid-20s, Rudolf had become what his education and position had made inevitable. An intelligent man with no purpose, a progressive thinker trapped in a reactionary institution, an heir who understood he was inheriting a system he believed was dying. He told his friend Moritz Seps, a Jewish newspaper editor, that the Habsburg monarchy was finished, that nationalism would tear it apart, that his future role was presiding over an empire's slow collapse. Seps asked what he planned to do about it. Rudolf said there was nothing to do except wait. The morphine use increased. Rudolf discovered that the drug not only dulled physical pain, but quieted the mental restlessness that made sleep impossible. He began using it daily, small doses at first, then larger ones as tolerance built. His personal physician, noting the dependency, warned about addiction. Rudolf ignored the warning. The alternative was feeling everything clearly, and clarity had become unbearable. In 1886, Rudolf developed gonorrhea from one of his affairs and passed it to Stephanie. The infection rendered her unable to have more children. Franz Joseph, informed of the situation, was furious. His son had destroyed the possibility of a male heir. Rudolf was lectured about duty, about responsibility, about the basic requirement that crown princes produce successors. He sat through the lecture in silence, his face blank. When his father finished, Rudolf returned to his apartments and increased his morphine dose. Stephanie, humiliated and bitter, stopped speaking to her husband except when protocol required it. Their daughter, Elizabeth Marie, was raised by governesses and saw her parents separately. Rudolf occasionally visited the child, tried to feel paternal affection, failed. He saw in his daughter the same trap he had experienced, a child born into a role, shaped by forces beyond her control, destined to serve dynastic purposes rather than live for herself. At 28, Rudolf had exhausted the distractions available to someone in his position. Travel was boring. The same European capitals, the same aristocratic hosts, the same meaningless conversations. Hunting had lost its appeal. Killing animals felt pointless when he could not kill the institution that imprisoned him. Affairs provided temporary physical release but no connection. Work was impossible because he had no actual work. Crown princes attended ceremonies. They did not govern. The only thing he could do reliably was consume morphine and wait for something to change. Nothing changed. Franz Joseph continued ruling. The empire continued functioning. Rudolf continued existing without purpose, educated beyond his station, intelligent enough to see the trap but not free enough to escape it. Rudolf met Mary Vetsera in November 1888 at a court function. She was 17, the daughter of a diplomat's widow, ambitious and infatuated with the idea of imperial romance. She was not the first young woman to pursue the crown prince, but she was persistent. Rudolph, 30 years old and profoundly bored, allowed the affair to begin. Within weeks, Mary was writing him letters declaring eternal love. Rudolph was taking more morphine than usual and writing back. The affair was indiscreet, Mary told her friends. The friends gossiped. The gossip reached the court, then reached Franz Joseph, who summoned his son in January 1889 and told him to end it. The girl was too young, too inappropriate, and the scandal was damaging the crown prince's reputation. Rudolph agreed to end the affair. He did not end it. He met Mary again the following week. On January 28th, Rudolph traveled to Mayerling, a hunting lodge south of Vienna in the Vienna woods. The lodge was small, isolated, a place Rudolph used for shooting parties and private retreats. He brought Mary with him. His companions for the hunting trip noticed the girl but said nothing. Aristocratic men kept mistresses. The crown prince keeping a mistress at a hunting lodge was unremarkable. Rudolph and Mary dined with the other guests that evening. Rudolph seemed tense, drank heavily, excused himself early. He and Mary retired to his private rooms. The other guests heard nothing unusual during the night. In the morning, when Rudolph failed to appear for breakfast, his valet knocked on the bedroom door. There was no answer. The valet knocked again, then broke down the door. Rudolph was dead, shot through the head. Mary was dead beside him, also shot through the head. A revolver lay near Rudolph's hand. The room smelled of gunpowder and blood. The bodies had been dead for hours, possibly since the previous night. There were empty glasses on the table, wine possibly mixed with poison, though the autopsy would later be inconclusive. What was clear was that Rudolph had shot Mary, then himself. The order of death mattered legally, but not practically. Both were dead. The valet sent word to Vienna immediately. Franz Joseph received the news while working at his desk. He stopped, stood, said nothing for several minutes. Then he ordered the information contained until the bodies could be retrieved and examined. The priority was preventing scandal. The emperor's son had committed murder-suicide with a teenage girl. The monarchy could not absorb that truth without damage. Elizabeth was in Hungary when the message arrived. She was with Marie Valerie, planning a trip to Corfu. The telegram was brief. Rudolph was dead, circumstances unclear. Return to Vienna immediately. She left within hours, arriving at the Hofburg late that evening. Franz Joseph told her what had been found at Mayerling: the bodies, the gun, the evidence that their son had killed himself and a girl. Elizabeth stood silently, then said she needed to be alone. She did not cry immediately. She retreated to her apartments, dismissed her attendants, locked the doors. For hours, there was silence. Then, late that night, screaming, grief released in a form her household had never witnessed. The servants stood in the hallways listening to the Empress howl. By morning, she was silent again. She dressed in black and did not remove the mourning clothes for the rest of her life. The official story was constructed quickly. Rudolph had died of heart failure. No mention of Mary Vetsera. No mention of the gun. The girl's body was removed from Mayerling secretly, transported to a cemetery, buried at night without ceremony. Her family was told to remain silent. The imperial machinery of concealment functioned efficiently. Within days, newspapers were reporting the crown prince's tragic death from natural causes. Foreign governments sent condolences. The public mourned. The funeral was held at the Capuchin Church, the traditional burial place for Habsburgs. Rudolph's body lay in state while Vienna filed past to pay respects. Franz Joseph stood beside the coffin, expressionless. Elizabeth attended but could not stand for the full ceremony. She sat, veiled, while priests recited prayers over the son she had rarely seen in the last decade of his life. Gisela came from Munich with her husband. Marie Valerie, 20 years old, stood beside her mother throughout. Stephanie, Rudolph's widow, wore black and showed no emotion. The burial was underground in the Habsburg crypt. Rudolph was placed in a bronze sarcophagus beside other dead archdukes. The lid was sealed. Franz Joseph returned to work the next day. The empire required governance regardless of personal loss. He resumed his schedules, his routines, his methodical signing of documents. He never spoke publicly about his son's death. Elizabeth's grief was different. She commissioned a death mask made from Rudolph's face, kept it in her apartments, spoke to it. She wrote poetry about her son, morbid, self-pitying verses that blamed fate, God, the empire, everyone, except herself. She described Rudolph as a victim of circumstance, a sensitive soul destroyed by the rigidity of Habsburg life. She did not mention that she had been largely absent during his childhood, that she had encouraged his liberal education without preparing him for the impossibility of liberal action, that she had visited Vienna rarely while he was descending into morphine addiction and despair. The question of why Rudolph killed himself was never officially answered. The unofficial explanations multiplied: political desperation, fear of his father's anger over the affair, mental illness inherited from the Wittelsbach line, morphine addiction, philosophical despair over the empire's future. All were partially true. None were complete. Rudolph had been intelligent enough to see the futility of his position and trapped enough that suicide became the only choice he could make autonomously. Elisabeth adopted the suicide as her defining tragedy, replacing little Sophie's death as the central grief of her life. She had lost a daughter as a child, lost a son as an adult, and both losses confirmed her belief that she was cursed, that her life was marked by suffering beyond her control. She did not examine her role in either death, her passivity with Sophie, her absence with Rudolph. The grief was too useful as it was, pure and uncomplicated by responsibility. She remained in Vienna for 3 months after the funeral, longer than she had stayed continuously in years. Then she left for Corfu, taking Marie Valerie, leaving Gisela to return to Munich alone. Franz Joseph remained in the Hofburg, governing an empire that had lost its heir. The succession would now pass to Franz Joseph's nephew, Franz Ferdinand. Rudolph's daughter, Elisabeth Marie, was 7 years old and fatherless. Stephanie would remarry eventually to a Hungarian count and live quietly. The machinery of empire adjusted and continued. Marie Valerie was 21 in 1889 when her brother died. She had spent her entire life as her mother's possession, raised in Hungary to spite Vienna, kept close through childhood and adolescence, told repeatedly that she was the only one Elisabeth truly loved. The devotion was suffocating. Marie Valerie had no friends outside her mother's household, no experiences that were not supervised, no identity separate from being the favored daughter. Rudolph's death changed something in her, though she did not say so immediately. Elisabeth's grief after Mayerling was overwhelming and performative. She wore black exclusively, wrote poetry about death, commissioned photographs of herself in mourning clothes that she sent to relatives. She visited Rudolph's rooms at the Hofburg and sat in silence for hours. She had altars built in his memory. She spoke about him constantly, describing his sensitivity, his intelligence, his victimization by a court that never understood him. Marie Valerie listened, said nothing, and began to understand that her mother's grief was about herself, not about Rudolph. The first act of separation was small. In 1890, Marie Valerie expressed interest in Franz Salvator, an archduke from a minor branch of the Habsburg family. He was not a prestigious match, no throne, no significant wealth, no political importance. Elisabeth opposed the marriage. She wanted Marie Valerie to marry someone who would keep her close, someone who would allow Elisabeth continued access to her daughter. Franz Salvator lived modestly and had no connection to Hungary. Marie Valerie would have to leave. Marie Valerie insisted. It was the first time she had opposed her mother directly. She was 22 years old enough to marry, entitled to choose within the limits of her class. Franz Joseph supported the match. He liked Franz Salvator and saw no political reason to oppose it. Elisabeth argued, sulked, told Marie Valerie she was being ungrateful after everything her mother had sacrificed. Marie Valerie remained firm. The engagement was announced in January 1890. Elisabeth treated the engagement as betrayal. She had raised Marie Valerie differently from the others, kept her close, given her the attention Gisela and Rudolph had been denied. And now Marie Valerie was choosing to leave, to marry an unimportant archduke, and live an ordinary aristocratic life. Elisabeth told her daughter she was making a mistake, that she would regret choosing mediocrity, that she had been raised for something better than becoming a provincial archduchess. Marie Valerie did not argue. She had spent 22 years listening to her mother, absorbing her moods, managing her demands. She had watched Elizabeth ignore Gisela and Rudolph, had seen her mother's grief over Rudolph's death transform into theatrical mourning that served her own need for drama. She had understood slowly that her mother's love was not actually love but ownership. The marriage to Franz Salvator was escape. The wedding took place in July 1890 at Bad Ischl. It was smaller than Gisela's wedding, less formal, appropriate for a minor archduke marrying an archduchess. Elizabeth attended but made her displeasure visible. She wore black mourning clothes to her daughter's wedding. She left the reception early, citing exhaustion. She did not congratulate Marie Valerie or Franz Salvator warmly. The message was clear. By marrying, Marie Valerie had chosen against her mother. Marie Valerie and Franz Salvator moved to a modest estate in Walsee, hours from Vienna, farther from the imperial court. They lived quietly. No grand receptions, no political ambitions, no attempt to maintain significant presence at court. Franz Salvator managed the estate. Marie Valerie began having children, 10 in total over the next 15 years. She raised them herself, hired governesses she selected, maintained control over their daily lives in ways her mother never had with her. Elizabeth visited occasionally, arrived unannounced, stayed for days or weeks, then left abruptly. During these visits, she dominated the household, criticized Marie Valerie's child-rearing choices, demanded attention from her grandchildren, then complained that they were too noisy or too undisciplined. Marie Valerie endured the visits, said little, waited for her mother to leave. The relationship had reversed. Now Marie Valerie was the one performing duty while feeling nothing. The domesticity Marie Valerie chose was deliberate rejection of everything Elizabeth represented. Where Elizabeth had traveled constantly, Marie Valerie stayed home. Where Elizabeth had starved herself, Marie Valerie ate normally and gained weight with each pregnancy. Where Elizabeth had obsessed over beauty and youth, Marie Valerie let herself age without resistance. She was not beautiful like her mother had been, and she did not try to be. She was ordinary, content, focused on her children and her husband. It was the opposite of imperial glamour, and that was the point. Elizabeth interpreted the ordinariness as waste. She had protected Marie Valerie from Vienna, raised her with privileges Gisela never had, given her the full force of maternal attention. And Marie Valerie had used that freedom to choose provincial domesticity with an unimportant husband. Elizabeth told her ladies-in-waiting that Marie Valerie had disappointed her, that the girl had no ambition, that she had settled for less than she deserved. She did not recognize that Marie Valerie had chosen the only life that would free her from being her mother's project. By 1895, Marie Valerie had been married 5 years and had 4 children. Elizabeth saw her daughter once or twice a year, brief visits that were formal and tense. Marie Valerie wrote dutiful letters describing her children's development, the estate's management, the ordinary details of domestic life. Elizabeth responded rarely. She was traveling constantly. Corfu, Cap Martin, Geneva, anywhere that was not Vienna. She had lost Rudolph to suicide and Marie Valerie to normalcy. Gisela remained in Munich, distant and formal, writing occasional letters Elizabeth did not answer. Elizabeth was 58, still beautiful, but visibly aging despite her efforts. Her hair, once her greatest pride, had started graying. She dyed it with henna, a process that took hours and left it brittle. Her weight remained dangerously low. Her face showed lines no amount of creams could erase. The beauty she had maintained through discipline was losing its battle with time. Marie Valerie, watching her mother age into a woman who had nothing except fading looks and morbid poetry, understood she had made the correct choice. The empire had given Elizabeth everything: title, wealth, palaces, the finest possessions Europe could offer. It had destroyed her anyway. Marie Valerie's provincial estate, her ordinary husband, her noisy children, they were small, unglamorous, hers. She had chosen smallness over grandeur because she had seen what grandeur cost. Elizabeth never forgave the defection, though she never named it as such. She simply stopped mentioning Marie Valerie in her letters, stopped visiting Walsee, stopped pretending interest in her grandchildren. She had lost all 3 of her older children in different ways, and the only one remaining was also the one who had most deliberately walked away. Elizabeth turned 60 in 1897. She marked the occasion by refusing to acknowledge it. She told her attendants that she was 59 and would remain 59 until she decided otherwise. The fiction was maintained in her household through polite silence. No one corrected her. No one mentioned that her face, despite the dyed hair and the hours of beauty treatments, showed her actual age. She had been traveling for nearly 40 years, but the travel had lost whatever purpose it once pretended to have. There were no more health treatments to justify the trips, no more hunting seasons to attend, no more political reasons for visiting foreign countries. She simply moved from Corfu to Cap Martin to Geneva to Bad Ischl, staying weeks or months before departing again. Her household traveled with her, ladies-in-waiting, hairdresser, reader. Enough servants to maintain the routines she required. The entourage was expensive, exhausting to manage, and completely unnecessary, except that Elizabeth could not tolerate stillness. The Aquileion in Corfu had become her primary residence, though residence was too stable a word for how she inhabited it. She stayed for months, walking the gardens alone, sitting in rooms filled with statues of dying Greek heroes, writing poetry that grew increasingly morbid. The poems were about death, her own death, Rudolph's death, the death of beauty, the death of meaning. She compared herself to doomed mythological figures, Achilles, Odysseus, Heine's broken poets. The self-dramatization was constant, exhausting. She had the poems printed privately, distributed to family members and a few trusted friends. The verses were technically competent, but emotionally adolescent. Endless variations on the theme that she was tragic, misunderstood, marked by suffering that lesser people could not comprehend. Gisela received copies and did not respond. Marie Valerie received copies and sent brief acknowledgments. Franz Joseph, still governing the empire in his late 60s, read them and said nothing. Elizabeth's beauty routines had become more desperate as aging progressed. She wore veils in public to hide her face. She refused to be photographed after 1890, allowing only her earlier portraits to circulate. She commissioned paintings based on photographs from her 30s, presenting a version of herself that no longer existed. When visitors came to the Aquileion, she received them in dim lighting or through screens that obscured her features. The woman who had been the most beautiful empress in Europe could not tolerate being seen as anything less. The diet had reached dangerous extremes. She consumed mostly liquids, broth, milk, occasional spoonfuls of pureed vegetables. Her weight dropped below 90 pounds. Her attendants reported that she was constantly cold, that her hands trembled, that she fainted occasionally during her long walks. Physicians examined her and found malnutrition, anemia, damage to her internal organs from decades of starvation. They recommended proper meals. She dismissed them and found new physicians who would not insist. Rudolph's death remained her central identity 9 years after Mayerling. She visited his rooms in Vienna when she was forced to return for court obligations, stood among his belongings, spoke about him as if he had been a perfect son destroyed by forces beyond anyone's control. She did not mention that she had seen him perhaps 20 times in the decade before his death, that she had been in Corfu or England during most of his final years, that he had written her letters she had not answered. The mythology she constructed around Rudolph was elaborate and false. She described him as a liberal reformer who had wanted to modernize the empire, a progressive thinker crushed by reactionary forces. She did not mention his morphine addiction, his string of meaningless affairs, his political impotence, or the fact that he had murdered a teenage girl before killing himself. The real Rudolph, complicated, damaged, lost, was less useful than the martyred saint she created from his corpse. In 1896, Elizabeth attended the 1000th anniversary celebration of Hungary as a kingdom. It was one of her rare public appearances, and she attended only because Hungary mattered to her in ways Vienna never had. She wore black, as always veiled. Standing beside Franz Joseph during ceremonies, the Hungarians cheered for her. She had been their advocate at court, had learned their language, had pushed for the compromise that gave them autonomy. They remembered her as beautiful and sympathetic. They could not see behind the veil what she had become. She left immediately after the celebrations, returning to Corfu. Franz Joseph remained in Vienna, governing alone. Alone as he had effectively done for decades. Their marriage existed only in formality. They saw each other a few times a year, exchanged letters occasionally, maintained the appearance of partnership without substance. He had accepted long ago that she would never return permanently, that the empire meant nothing to her, that his loneliness was simply a condition of his position. Elizabeth's relationship with her surviving children had atrophied into near silence. Gisela was 41, living in Munich with her 4 children, married to a man who treated her with indifference. She and Elizabeth exchanged perfunctory letters on birthdays and holidays. They had not had a meaningful conversation in years. The relationship had never been meaningful. Elizabeth had arranged Gisela's marriage, then forgotten about her. Marie Valerie was 29, raising her growing family at Walsey. She wrote to her mother occasionally with news of the children. Elizabeth's responses when they came were brief and self-focused, descriptions of her health, her travels, her latest poems. She rarely mentioned the grandchildren by name. When she visited Walsey, which was infrequent, she arrived unannounced, disrupted the household, then left without warmth. Marie Valerie had learned to keep her mother at a distance, to protect her children from the emotional chaos Elizabeth carried with her. Franz Joseph's nephew, Franz Ferdinand, was now heir to the throne. He was everything Rudolf had not been: conservative, militaristic, practical. Franz Joseph was training him carefully, trying not to repeat whatever mistakes had produced Rudolf's collapse. Elizabeth had no interest in the new heir. He was nothing to her. She had lost the son who mattered, and the succession meant only that the dynasty would continue without her caring whether it did. At 60, Elizabeth had become exactly what her life had made inevitable: a beautiful woman who had lost her beauty, a mother who had abandoned her children, an empress who had rejected her empire, a tragic figure who had nothing to be tragic about except the emptiness she had chosen. She wandered through European hotels and private estates, performing grief, maintaining beauty rituals for a face that was dying, writing poetry about suffering she had never examined closely enough to understand. Elizabeth left Corfu in late August 1898. She had been restless, even by her standards, moving through the Echelion's rooms without settling, dismissing meals, complaining that the heat exhausted her. Her lady-in-waiting, Countess Stare, suggested a change of scenery. Elizabeth agreed immediately. They would go to Switzerland, Geneva, perhaps Montreux, somewhere cooler. The decision was made quickly, as all her travel decisions were now. She had no schedule, no obligations, no one expecting her anywhere. They arrived in Geneva on September 9th, staying at the Hotel Beau Rivage under a false name. Elizabeth preferred traveling incognito when possible, avoiding the ceremonies and formal receptions that came with being empress. She registered as Countess of Hohenems, an old Habsburg title that meant nothing to Swiss hotel staff. The anonymity was partial, fragile. She was still accompanied by attendants, still required elaborate accommodations, still recognizable to anyone who studied her carefully. She spent the afternoon of September 9th walking along the lake with Countess Stare. She wore black, as always, with a dark veil. She carried a small fan and complained about the heat, though the weather was mild. They visited shops. Elizabeth bought nothing, simply looked at items and moved on. They had tea at a cafe near the water. Elizabeth ate nothing, drank weak tea, watched people pass. She seemed distracted, speaking little, responding to the Countess's attempts at conversation with brief answers. That evening, she mentioned casually that she had noticed a man watching her during their walk. He had been standing near the hotel, then appeared again near the shops. Countess Stare asked if she should report it to the hotel staff. Elizabeth said no, it was probably nothing. She went to bed early, woke during the night, walked through her hotel rooms until dawn. The insomnia was chronic. She had not slept full nights in years. September 10th was warm, clear. Elizabeth planned to take the afternoon steamer across the lake to Montreux, where she might stay a few days before deciding where to go next. She and Countess Stare left the hotel at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, walking toward the quay. The distance was short, less than 10 minutes on foot. They walked slowly. Elizabeth tired easily despite her daily exercise routines. A man approached them as they neared the pier. He was young, thin, poorly dressed. Luigi Luciani, 25 years old, Italian, unemployed, anarchist. He had been in Geneva for weeks, reading radical newspapers, attending meetings where men discussed revolution and the overthrow of aristocracy. He had decided to assassinate someone important, a symbolic act that would strike at the ruling class. He had originally planned to kill the Duke of Orléans, pretender to the French throne, but the Duke had cancelled his trip to Geneva. Luchesi needed another target. He had learned that an Austrian empress was staying at the Hôtel Beau Rivage. The newspapers had not reported it, but hotel workers talked, and information moved through the city. Luchesi did not know anything about Elizabeth specifically. He knew only that she was royalty, that killing her would serve his purpose. He bought a thin file from a shop, sharpened it to a point, and waited near the hotel. He saw Elizabeth and Countess Steyre leave. He followed them briefly, confirming they were walking toward the water. Then he ran up behind them and struck. The weapon, the sharpened file, entered Elizabeth's chest just below her left breast. The strike was precise, deep, aimed at the heart. Luchesi withdrew the weapon and ran. The entire attack took seconds. Elizabeth stumbled but did not fall immediately. She steadied herself against Countess Steyre, confused. The Countess asked if she was hurt. Elizabeth said no, she had felt something, but was fine. They continued walking toward the steamer. Elizabeth managed 20 more steps before collapsing. The Countess and several passers-by carried her to the steamer's deck. She was unconscious, her face pale, her breathing shallow. Someone loosened her corset, laced too tightly as always, compressing her chest to maintain the narrow waist she had spent decades preserving. Blood appeared on her undergarments, a small stain spreading slowly. The wound itself was tiny, barely visible. The sharpened file had created a puncture so narrow that external bleeding was minimal. Internally, the weapon had pierced her pericardium. Her heart was filling with blood, compressed, failing. Elizabeth regained consciousness briefly, opened her eyes, asked what had happened. Countess Steyre told her there had been an accident, that they were getting help. Elizabeth tried to speak again, but could not. She closed her eyes. Her breathing stopped minutes later. She was 60 years old. She died on the deck of a steamer in Geneva, dressed in black, surrounded by strangers. Luigi Luchesi was captured within the hour, still carrying the sharpened file. He confessed immediately, proudly. He told police he had killed an empress to strike at tyranny, that he regretted only that he had not killed someone more politically important. During interrogation, he admitted he knew almost nothing about Elizabeth, not her history, not her politics, not even her name when he decided to kill her. He had chosen her because she was available and royal. The assassination was symbolic, impersonal. She could have been anyone with a title. The body was taken back to the hotel, then transported to Vienna by train. Franz Joseph received the news while working. He was 68 years old. His son had killed himself 9 years earlier. His wife had spent most of their 44-year marriage avoiding him. Now she was dead, killed randomly by an anarchist who had not even known who she was. He ordered a state funeral and continued signing documents. The funeral was held at the Hofburg. Vienna turned out. Crowds lined the streets dressed in black, mourning an empress most of them had never seen in person. Elizabeth had avoided Vienna for so long that her death felt abstract, like losing someone who had already been gone. Gisela came from Munich. Marie Valerie came from Walsee with her husband. Both daughters wept publicly, performed grief for the woman who had abandoned them in different ways. Franz Joseph stood beside the coffin, expressionless as always, fulfilling his duties until the ceremony ended. Elizabeth was buried in the Habsburg crypt beside Rudolph. The bronze sarcophagus was sealed. The mourning period was observed. The court wore black for the required time. Then life continued. The empire continued. Franz Joseph continued ruling for 18 more years. The woman who had spent her life fleeing Vienna was finally trapped there, underground, unable to leave. Gisela was 42 when her mother died. She had been married for 25 years to a man who maintained polite distance, raised 4 children who had learned their manners and little else, and lived quietly in Munich performing the duties expected of a Bavarian princess. The telegram announcing Elizabeth's death arrived while she was supervising her daughter's piano lesson. She read it, dismissed the tutor, and sat alone in her drawing room for an hour before telling anyone. She traveled to Vienna for the funeral, wore black, stood beside her father and sister during the ceremonies. She wept when required. The tears were real, but not for the mother she remembered. Gisela had few memories of maternal affection to mourn. What she wept for was the possibility that had never existed. The mother who might have stayed, who might have fought to raise her own children, who might have loved her oldest daughter as much as she had loved the youngest. After the funeral, Gisela returned to Munich and resumed her routines. Nothing in her life changed. Elizabeth had not been present enough to leave a hole. The inheritance was substantial: money, properties, jewels. Elizabeth had barely worn in her final decades. Gisela accepted the inheritance without comment and used it to establish a small foundation, providing dowries for poor girls. The charity was modest, private, nothing that would draw attention. It was what Elizabeth could have done but never had. Gisela's children grew, married, produced grandchildren. She attended the weddings, visited the new families, performed the grandmother role with more consistency than her mother had managed as a parent. She never spoke publicly about Elizabeth. When journalists requested interviews about the famous empress, Gisela declined. When biographers wrote asking for memories, she responded with brief, formal letters, offering nothing of substance. The silence was protective, final. She lived until 1932, 76 years old, having survived both world wars, the collapse of the Habsburg monarchy, and the execution of her nephew Franz Ferdinand, Rudolph's replacement as heir, whose assassination in 1914 triggered the First War. She witnessed everything Elizabeth had escaped by dying in 1898. The empire dissolved, the palaces were emptied, the titles became historical artifacts. Gisela adjusted to smaller accommodations, reduced circumstances, the reality that aristocracy no longer guaranteed security. She survived because she had learned early that nothing was guaranteed, that mothers left, that safety came from expecting nothing. Marie Valerie was 30 when her mother died. She had been married 10 years, had 5 children with 5 more to come, and had built a life deliberately opposite to everything Elizabeth had chosen. The news of the assassination reached her at Walsee. She went to Vienna immediately, attended the funeral, stayed a week, then returned home. Her grief was complicated: relief mixed with guilt, freedom mixed with residual attachment. Elizabeth had left Marie Valerie the Achillean in Corfu. The villa was beautiful, expensive to maintain, and completely impractical for a woman raising 10 children in Austria. Marie Valerie visited once, walked through the rooms filled with death imagery and Greek statuary, and understood she had no use for her mother's shrine to mythological suffering. She sold it within 2 years to Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, who wanted a Mediterranean retreat. The money went into trusts for her children. Marie Valerie spent the rest of her life at Walsee, raising children, managing the estate with her husband, living quietly. She kept her mother's letters but rarely read them. She kept some of the jewelry, but never wore it. She commissioned no memorials, wrote no reminiscences, refused requests for interviews. When her children asked about their grandmother, she described her briefly: beautiful, troubled, often absent. She did not elaborate. She developed heart problems in her 40s, the same condition that had killed Elizabeth's mother. She died in 1924 at 56, younger than Elizabeth but having lived more fully. She left 10 children, 31 grandchildren, and a reputation for being kind, steady, present. No one called her tragic. No one wrote poems about her suffering. She had chosen ordinariness and died ordinary, which was exactly what she had wanted. Her children carried their grandmother's instability in their blood. Marie Valerie's son Franz Karl suffered from depression, paranoid thoughts, episodes of irrational behavior. Her daughter Elizabeth had nervous breakdowns, spent time in sanitariums, struggled with anxieties that had no clear cause. The Wittelsbach inheritance, the madness that had plagued Elizabeth's Bavarian family for generations, appeared in Marie Valerie's children, despite her attempts at normal domesticity. Mental illness did not care about good intentions or stable homes. Rudolph's daughter, Elizabeth Marie, was 9 when her father killed himself, 10 when her grandmother was assassinated. She grew up in the custody of her mother Stephanie, who remarried and focused on her new family. Elizabeth Marie was raised by governesses, saw her grandfather Franz Joseph occasionally, and learned early that being Rudolph's daughter meant carrying his tragedy without having known him well enough to grieve authentically. She married a German prince in 1902, divorced him in 1924, married a socialist politician afterward, a deliberate rejection of aristocratic convention. She lived through both world wars, lost her properties and title when the monarchy collapsed, worked as a social worker in Vienna during her later years. She died in 1963, having outlived everyone else in this story, the last direct link to Rudolph and Elizabeth. She wrote a memoir describing her grandmother as beautiful and distant, her father as absent even when alive. The memoir was published after her death, factual and unforgiving. Franz Joseph lived until 1916, ruling the empire for 68 years. He never remarried. He kept Elizabeth's apartments at the Hofburg exactly as she had left them, visiting the rooms occasionally during the 18 years after her death. He did not speak about her publicly. When asked, he said she had been a good wife and empress. The statement was diplomatic, automatic, meaningless. He died during the First World War, 2 years before the empire collapsed completely. His great-nephew Karl inherited the throne, ruled for 2 years, then was forced into exile when Austria-Hungary dissolved. The dynasty Elizabeth had spent her life fleeing ended a generation after her death. Everything she had resented, the rigid protocol, the dynastic obligations, the Habsburg supremacy, became historically obsolete. She had been right that it was dying. She had simply not understood that its death would not free anyone, that collapse would bring different suffering rather than liberation. The palaces were converted to museums. The jewels were catalogued, displayed behind glass. Elizabeth's portraits hung in galleries, still beautiful, forever frozen at the age when photographs stopped. Tourists walked through the rooms where she had been unhappy, read plaques describing her beauty and her tragic death, and left thinking they understood something about her life. Elizabeth was beautiful until she was not. She was empress for 44 years and spent most of them elsewhere. She bore 4 children and raised one obsessively while abandoning the others in different ways. She died randomly, killed by a man who did not know her name, which seemed fitting for a life spent fleeing identification. The wealth bought her nothing she wanted. The palaces became prisons she could leave but never escape. The title gave her status without authority, visibility without power. She had everything except the ability to live as she chose. And when she finally gained that freedom through relentless absence, she discovered she had nothing to do with it except travel, starve herself, and write bad poetry about her own suffering. Her children carried what she gave them. Gisela learned resignation. Rudolph learned despair. Marie Valerie learned that love meant suffocation. They survived or did not. They reproduced or remained childless. They passed her damage forward into the next generation, which passed it forward again, the inheritance spreading through bloodlines and marriages until it became impossible to trace what came from her specifically and what came from the general toxicity of aristocratic existence. The questions that remain have no satisfying answers. Would she have been happier if Sophie had allowed her to raise her own children, or would she have found other reasons to flee? Would Rudolph have lived if she had stayed in Vienna, or would his despair have found him regardless? Was her unhappiness the product of genuine constraint, or would she have been miserable in any life, because misery was the only identity she could sustain? The beauty faded. The empire collapsed. The children died. The palaces became museums where tourists paid admission to walk through rooms where someone had once been spectacularly unhappy. Her portraits remained, young, beautiful, frozen before everything went wrong. People still looked at them and thought they saw tragedy. They saw a woman who had everything, which meant they saw nothing at all. What remains is what she left behind: children damaged by her presence and absence, a husband who ruled alone, a grave in a crypt she had spent her life trying to escape. The wealth solved nothing. It simply made the emptiness more visible, more expensive, more carefully documented for people who would never understand what any of it meant.